So welcome to World War II Part 28. This is Pacific 1942 Part 4, and on this specific edition we are going to focus initially on two major sea battles that took place in 1942. The first is the Battle of Coral Sea, which a short time after was followed up by the decisive Battle of Midway. So we'll go to the Battle of Coral Sea first and take a look at that battle. Now, on 1st of May, US Naval Command had learnt of the projected Japanese landing on Tulagi in Solomon Islands, and the much larger landing the Japanese are now preparing to carry out in New Guinea itself. Now, the aircraft carriers Yorktown and Lexington, under command of Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, with escorting ships, are therefore dispatched to intercept the enemy force heading for the Solomons. So over days 2nd to 3rd of May, the Yorktown arrives off Tulagi, but the Japanese squadron escorting invasion force has already disappeared. Now, the Americans sink a number of enemy transports, but the main ships are gone for now. Then the rejoint rested ships concentrated in the Coral Sea. So there are two task forces in action, the 17th under Rear Admiral Fletcher and the 44th in support under British Rear Admiral Grace. So the two task forces comprise the aircraft carriers Lexington and Yorktown, combining 140 combat aircraft. They have 7 heavy cruisers, they have a number of light cruisers, 13 destroyers, 2 tankers and a seaplane support ship. Now, the 4th Japanese fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Inoue, with the task of covering Operation Mo, the landing at Port Moresby, consists of a strike force under Vice Admiral Takagi, a support group, a cover group, a patrol group and a landing group, intended partly for Tulagi and partly for Port Moresby. So the Japanese fleet in all comprise 3 aircraft carriers, the Shukaku, the Sakaku, they had a combined 125 aircraft, plus the light carrier Shohu. Now, the Japanese also had 8 cruisers, including the Miyoko, the Haguro, the Aoho, the Kako, etc. They had 17 destroyers, a seaplane transport, 7 submarines, 3 gunboats, a few mine layers, a few tankers and some smaller auxiliary craft. So 2 quite sizable fleets actually involved in the Battle of Coral Sea. Now, the Japanese can also call on 25th Flotilla of their Air Force that has a combined 160 aircraft, including reconnaissance aircraft, fighters, bombers from nearby land bases. So on 4th of May, in Coral Sea at 6:30 a.m. from a point 100 miles southwest of Guadalcanal, Fletcher sends up nearly 50 aircraft from Yorktown, and off Tulagi they managed to sink a Japanese destroyer, a minesweeper and 2 auxiliary support vessels. Other attacks carried out during day of May 4th have no success. Now, after the end of the day and all the following night, the 2 fleets searched for each other, but never managed to establish contact and fix a position on the other. There's definitely manoeuvring going around, but the fleets have not pinpointed each other as yet. Now, steaming full speed ahead, Fletcher joins with the Yorktown up with the Lexington, Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takagi and the Zuiku and the Shikaku, plus the cruisers and other escort vessels, sails just past the island of San Cristobal at the southeast tip at Solomons, and makes for the Louisades, to protect the left flank of Port Moresby invasion fleet. They don't want the invasion force, including the troop transports and equipment transports, being caught out by the American carriers and sunk. So on 7th of May, an American reconnaissance plane reports sighting 2 aircraft carriers and 4 heavy cruisers, while a Japanese aircraft has sighted the American fleet and has had time before being spotted and shot down to warn the base at Rabaul. But the message is only retransmitted to Vice Admiral Takagi after many hours delay, and therefore the American ships have already moved out of that position. So by the time Takagi gets the information on the American fleet, they are already gone. Now, meanwhile, just over 90 aircraft have taken off from 2 American carriers. At 1100 hours in the morning, they reach and sink the Japanese light aircraft carrier Shoho. Now, the Japanese have not yet been informed at presence of the American squadron, but their chance attacks upon an American destroyer and tanker and sink both. Now, in the afternoon, Takagi sends nearly 30 aircraft in search of the American ships, but only 6 of them return, okay? The others have been shot down or have lost their way and crashed into the sea after running out of fuel, or have plainly gone missing and never to be seen again. Probably shot down. So that's a bit of a blowing aircraft at Japanese there. Both sides at the moment have lost some ships here or there, but they have not managed to have the pitched battle that they are looking for. So on the 8th of May, in the Battle of Coral Sea at 9 a.m. in the morning, okay, aircraft from the Lexington and Yorktown take off in search of enemy again. Now, the Shikaku is hit and badly damaged, and the Zuikaku and her escort managed to escape undamaged. Now, Vice Admiral Takagi has dispatched 70 aircraft himself to seek and destroy the American ships. Now, the Yorktown just manages to escape from a torpedo attack and reports only slight damage, but the Lexington, the American carrier, is badly hit and takes on such a list that the returning aircraft cannot land on her flight deck. Okay, so basically the ship is listing to one side to the point where the aircraft cannot land or they'll roll off the ship. Okay, the ship has to be abandoned and before night falls, to prevent wreck falling into Japanese hands, she's sunk by a torpedo from an American plane. My goodness, what a horrible job that would have been, to American pilots, sending them out to sink their own aircraft carrier, albeit they really didn't want it falling into hands at Japanese. They could have retconned it, they could have done, who knows. But that must have been a horrible job for a pilot to detach the torpedoes to sink it. So the Americans lost 66 aircraft during battle and the Japanese about 70 now. The Japanese claim that the engagement is a victory, and it is true. They've inflicted greater losses on the enemy, including the loss of the American aircraft carrier, but they've suffered themselves in troops on transports, destroyers, a large number of aircraft as well. So the Japanese, it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory named after King of Epirus in Greece. King Pyrrhus. So they're forced to put off the landing of a large invasion fort at Port Moresby. So even though the Japanese claimed victory, they had to abandon their planned invasion of Port Moresby. So even though the Americans had lost an aircraft carrier, number of aircraft and some smaller ships, they had stopped the Japanese invading Port Moresby. So a bit of a victory for Americans there. Now, moreover, okay, for first, time since commencement of hostilities, an operation initiated by them has been met by the Americans on equal terms. Now, the Americans are now passing from a purely defensive strategy to a unified, a mixed defensive-offensive strategy. Now, Battle at Coral Sea is the first air-naval battle in history, and quite possibly the biggest. It's been fought exclusively by aircraft without the ships ever coming into direct contact. So it is the first battle of its type where aircraft carrier task forces of aircraft actually fight the battle attacking each other's ships, but there's no ship-to-ship engagement. So that is the Battle of the Coral Sea. So the Japanese claim victory, but the Americans stopped the invasion of Port Moresby. Now, the Americans lose one of the main aircraft carriers in their fleet, but the Japanese have also suffered a light carrier sunk and have also suffered, both sides have suffered, a number of ships sunk. So the next engagement, okay, is the all-important and decisive Battle of Midway. Now, the Japanese were planning, okay, after failing to destroy the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese, as you have seen, have been on the offensive everywhere. But one of the things that the Japanese still had in mind was to try and cripple the American fleet. Now, the Battle of Coral Sea and the Doolittle raid, okay, the 25 American bombers who actually bombed Japan, okay, causing a massive psychological scar on the Japanese as they realised they were not, immune to bombing raids. All of these things came together and the Japanese decided we need to have a decisive battle to take out those American carriers. Even though America's war industry is now getting into full gear, it will buy us time. It will buy us time to complete our objectives, reinforce our front lines, set up the proper supply networks for the inevitable time when the Americans would come back, re-equipped and fresh with new aircraft carriers. The Japanese wanted a period where they could just stabilise themselves, everything they were doing, finish capturing objectives. Now, one thing, okay, the Japanese used a coding system, okay, now the Americans did break the code, but the problem is they had no idea what codes what names the Japanese used in what relation to which islands or ports or, etc., etc. So what the Americans started doing is they started ordering that all communiques from their different bases, okay, would have like a code name. Okay, now Midway's code name was AF. The Aleutian Islands, Pearl Harbor, other areas used different codes. Okay, so the idea was that the Americans would use these codes when referencing themselves. So then when they listened to Japanese codes, if any of those names came up, the Americans would understand where the Japanese were talking about. But one of them, okay, came off as AF. They kept picking up traffic about an AF, okay? So a very clever American officer decided to come up with a plan. He thought AF represented Midway, okay, but he needed to be 100% sure because the Americans didn't want to put the carriers somewhere and the Japanese, they didn't want to put the carriers near Midway to defend Midway if Pearl Harbor was the target, if the Aleutians or some other area was the target, okay, they needed to know where to put the carriers. So basically, okay, this very clever American officer with a certain element of guile put out a message that Midway's water filtration, sea distillation system was damaged, okay, and they sent that out, and then they got confirmation that AF's water distillation plant was damaged. So they then knew that AF was Midway, and the Americans knew at that point, okay, that the Japanese were going to attack Midway. So basically, okay, on 27th of May, okay, Japanese naval squadron commanded by Vice Admiral Nagumo, okay, leaves the base in Japan between Honshu and Shikoku Islands, bound for Midway. Now, Nagumo's fleet comprises 21 ships, including 4 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. Now, he also has a battleship, a number of cruisers, both small and heavy, plus other support ships. Now, the objective is to capture Midway Island, okay, an American base from which their bombers control a vast area of the Pacific. Now, the Japanese obviously also had a side diversion where the Japanese would attack the Aleutian Islands to make the Americans think the Aleutians were the real target. But actually, this ruse was already broken because the Americans knew they were going for Midway and therefore did not send the carriers in defense of the Aleutians. They were kept in preparation for the attack on Midway. Now, at the same time, an invasion force of 5,000 men on board 12 transports, escorted by 2 battleships and 4 heavy cruisers, plus smaller support ships under the command of Vice Admiral Kurita, sails from Saipan and Guam, and from those bases there, support groups commanded by Vice Admirals Tanaku and Kondo. 600 miles, 24 hours sailing time behind Nagumo's squadron. The main fleet sails under command of Admiral Yamamoto, including, among others, the most powerful battleship in the world, the Yamato, that of course will be covered on one of my warship videos, the mighty battleship Yamato. So basically, okay, the Yamato set sail with Admiral Yamamoto, the main fleet commander. There were 2 other battleships, the Mutsu and the Nagato, together with an escort of 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, plus auxiliary ships. So basically, they sailed from there. Nagumo is now heading for Midway. The Japanese are heading for Aleutians. The stage is set. So on 28th of May, okay, Americans are in possession of secret code, as I mentioned, and aware of their intentions, not merely the capture of Midway Island, but also to draw Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet, weaker than Japanese fleet, into a trap. Now, Nimitz accordingly orders Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Spruance to sail for Midway. Now, his fleet force comprises the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet, the heavy cruisers Pensacola, Northampton, New Orleans, Minneapolis, and Vincennes, okay? The light cruiser Atlanta, 11 destroyers, 2 tankers, and 19 submarines. So the both fleets from both sides are now on their way to position themselves ready for the Battle of Midway on May 30th. Task Force 17 under Admiral Fletcher also sails from Pearl Harbor. It consists of aircraft carrier Yorktown and the heavy cruisers Portland and Astoria, included also are 6 destroyers. So the following day on 31st of May, okay, Japanese intercept at least 180 radio messages, many of them urgent, and suspect the enemy knows of their presence. Now, Nagumo's squadron, ahead at main body of fleet, has to observe radio silence for fear of the Americans discovering their position. On June 2nd, Nagumo, okay, has to carry out an unexpected change of course, which Admiral Yamamoto must be informed. So he decides to send a signal on his internal communication system, which is very low powered, with less chance of being detected. Now, the mighty Yamato receives the signal, okay, but the Americans, although they are actually nearer to Japanese squadron, fail to intercept it. So a signal is sent, the Americans don't pick up on it. Otherwise, the Americans could have launched a strike against Nagumo's carriers before he even launched his planes, which could have been devastating. So Spruance and Fletcher's task force rendezvous about 350 miles northeast of Midway. Fletcher takes overall command of operation and moves the two squadrons to some 200 miles north of Midway. Now, basically the plan here, okay, Midway Island, of course, has defences, has a small garrison, has aircraft, okay. One of the plans here is for the Japanese, with the Americans not knowing their location, is for the Japanese planes to attack Midway. At this point, the Americans, who are north and northeast of Midway, will know the attack vector that the Japanese planes have come in from, and then can launch their aircraft as the Japanese planes head off back to their carriers. So the idea is that the American planes will arrive at the Japanese fleet when the Japanese fleet's aircraft carrier decks are full of aircraft being refueled, and they will be a prime sitting duck. So on June 4th, okay, at 4:30 a.m., okay, local time, reconnaissance aircraft and bombers take off from the aircraft carriers Akage and Kaga and the cruisers Tone, Chikuma and Haruna. Now, the first wave includes over 100 fighters and dive bombers, make straight for Midway, but they failed to surprise the Americans. When still 150 miles from their target, they're spotted by a US seaplane, which quickly turns around and gets to the island ahead of them, firing a rocket to warn the fighters already alerted that an attack is imminent. Now, the Japanese come off better in the engagement with American aircraft, but they fail to achieve the objective of their mission, the neutralization of the American aircraft on Midway. So 2.5 hours later, at 7 a.m. in the morning, a second attack is ordered. 5 minutes later, the alarm sounds on board Nagumo's ship. Now, a destroyer has sighted enemy aircraft, okay, a squadron of bombers. Their attack is driven off by anti-aircraft fire from the destroyers and cruisers. The battleship Karashima and the Akagi itself, the Americans' main target. At this point, the aircraft in Japanese second wave have to replace the torpedoes with which they have been armed for attack on the American aircraft carriers, with bombs for another attack on Midway, which has not been neutralized. And this is one of the main points of the battle. Okay, the Japanese initially were getting torpedoes fitted after they came back, but then a decision was made to stop fitting the torpedoes to attack the American ships, and let's change our mind and start taking the torpedoes off and fitting it with bombs for a second attack on Midway. Now, all of this is taking time, is wasting time. So at this point, okay, the aircraft in the Japanese second wave have begun to replace the torpedoes, which they'd been armed for an attack on the American aircraft carriers, with bombs for another attack on Midway. Now, between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. in the morning, okay, while the flight decks at Japanese carriers are still clustered with torpedoes, bombs, and aircraft waiting to take off, 131 dive bombers and torpedo planes from aircraft carriers Hornet, Enterprise and Yorktown appear over Nagumo's fleet in successive waves. Now, many American aircraft are destroyed, and the Japanese suffer no major damage. Now, at 9:30 a.m. on that morning, more American aircraft attack the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the American submarine Nautilus attacks the Japanese carriers with torpedoes. At 10:20 a.m., Vice Admiral Nagumo orders the aircraft to take off. Now, after that, barely 4 minutes later, okay, 4 minutes after Nagumo gives the orders for aircraft to take off, American dive bombers attack the Japanese carriers. The Akagi, Soryu, and Kaga are all hit, okay, serious fires break out and there are explosions among the aircraft and bombs on the flight decks. Only the Hiryu manages to escape the enemy bombers. At 2:45 p.m. in afternoon on June 4th, American aircraft carrier Yorktown is hit by aircraft from the Hiryu. On 5th of June, 3:30 p.m, Yamamoto has the wreck of the Akagi torpedoed. The crew are safely taken on board the cruiser Nagaru. So at 6 p.m, another attack by aircraft from the Enterprise sink the Japanese carrier Hiryu. At 7 p.m, the American carrier, the aircraft carrier Soryu, badly damaged the previous day, sinks with a whole complement of 728 men, including the captain, who goes down with the ship. And at 7:25 p.m, the aircraft carrier Kaga, also hit the day before, sinks. On the 6th of June at 2:15 a.m, the cruisers Megami and Mikuma collide. At 3 a.m, on June 6th, Admiral Yamamoto orders a general withdrawal. Now, during the next few hours, the Megumi and the Mikumi, though damaged, do manage to get away. But this has been a major calamitous defeat for Japan, but through the night, American aircraft managed to locate the Mikuma and attack her and sink her. Now, a Japanese submarine also manages to attack and sink the American destroyer Haman. So with their aircraft back on board, the Americans lose contact with the retreating enemy. So on 7th of June, a Japanese submarine torpedoes and sinks the American aircraft carrier Yorktown. Already hit on the 4th, she's been withdrawing at reduced speed. Now, this is one of the most important naval battles in history. Now, the thing about this attack is the Japanese launched their attack on Midway. The American carriers are north and northeast. And then, as the Japanese planes start to withdraw, the Americans launch their counter airstrike to basically follow the trajectory of the Japanese aircraft back to their carrier. Obviously with the distance, but they know the vector that the planes have come in on. So basically the Japanese planes come back, they start they start fitting torpedoes, but then an order is given, because Midway is still active and the aircraft on it are not fully destroyed, to change it with bombs. And in the middle of this, the American aircraft come in, many of them attack, but a second wave come in, causes damage. And over the next few days, Japan loses a number of their aircraft carriers. It really is a devastating battle for the Japanese. They've lost the aircraft carrier Hiryu, and even then the next day, they just lose a number of aircraft carriers over the preceding days, and they have suffered heavy losses in aircraft as well. And Midway has not been neutralized. One of the main things is Midway has not been neutralized. So this is one of the major battles of World War II, and a major turning point following the Battle of Coral Sea, which the Japanese claimed as a win. And the Americans had lost a carrier, and there have been a number of aerial engagements between the carrier flotillas of aircraft, but the invasion of Port Moresby had been put off, even though the Japanese claimed victory. But at Midway, the Japanese carriers were whacked hard. A number of those carriers were sunk, and aircraft carriers are not as easily replaced as other ships. The Japanese had also lost a large number of aircraft, a large number of naval personnel. Yes, the Americans had lost a carrier. Yes, the Americans had lost some other support ships, but it was an overwhelming victory for the United States. So, one of the most important naval battles in history. Now, Japanese lost over 3,500 men, 4 aircraft carriers and a cruiser, and over 330 aircraft now. But worst of all is the loss of the high proportion of their bravest and most experienced aircraft carrier pilots. Now, moreover, they've filled in their objectives of seizing Midway. Now, the Americans, by comparison, the Japanese have lost 3,500 men, 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, over 300 aircraft. The Americans, by comparison, only lose just over 300 men, 1 destroyer, 1 aircraft carrier, and less than half the number of aircraft, losing about 150. So ultimately, it is a major victory for the American carrier task force. Now, they can celebrate the great victory. Battle of Midway Midway marks the turning point in the Pacific War, because the Japanese have been on the ascendancy. The Japanese have been on the offensive, and as I've demonstrated, they have been attacking everywhere, and have had much success. The taking of Singapore. They've pushed right now to the Indian border in Burma and are now starting to cross it. They have seized pretty much most of the Philippines now, just some small pockets of resistance left. The Japanese ascendancy has been huge in the Dutch East Indies, on the outskirts of New Guinea, everywhere. But Coral Sea and Midway, Coral Sea kind of is an even keel for me, even though the Americans suffered heavier losses, but Port Moresby was spared invading by the Japanese. As I said, they didn't want to risk their troop transports getting hit full of their invasion force for Port Moresby. But Midway was a decisive victory. Okay, so even with the loss of that American aircraft carrier, Midway was a decisive victory. Japan lost 4 carriers in total, heavy losses. So in the Pacific 1942, in the midst of all this, between, Midway and Coral Sea, in the Philippines, in May, the Japanese take Dalirang on Mindanao, putting the defenders to rout. The conquest island of Mindanao is now virtually complete. Also on May 9th, following the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese Supreme Command orders the suspension of the Port Moresby landing. Now at Tonga, the Americans land forces at Tonga, and at the Galapagos Islands, American units land with permission of the governor of Ecuador. So America is now starting to send garrisons to other areas, and the Americans do follow this line. They also start sending reinforcements to other areas as well. Now in the Philippines, General Sharp, commanding American and Filipino forces in central Philippines and Mindanao, orders his troops to surrender. Small groups continue to hold out both in southern Philippines and on Luzon itself, but they lay down their arms during the next month. So there are isolated pockets of resistance, but those pockets are slowly being strangled out by the Japanese. Now in China, also in May, the Japanese launch a local offensive in the Zhejiang province, and meanwhile in Burma, the Japanese cross the river Salween. So the Japanese, even with the setbacks of Coral Sea and Midway to come, the Japanese are still on the offensive everywhere. Now on Fiji, also in May 1942, American troops land to replace the New Zealand troops, the Anzac troops that are actually stationed in Fiji. American troops land to replace them. Meanwhile in Burma, British troops withdrawing from Burma reach the Indian border at Tamu in Assam. Meanwhile, another American division, the 32nd American Division, arrives in Australia. One of the worries that the Americans and Pacific allies, Britain, etc., had was that the Japanese may actually make a move for North Australia. Now, the Japanese put a lot of emphasis on having to take New Guinea as the preempt to invade Australia. They have not achieved that goal, but the Americans and British are not to know that. They are still worried that an attack on Northern Australia could happen. So the Americans send reinforcements there. Now in New Guinea, half of all the Australian brigade and groups of anti-aircraft gunners leave for Port Moresby, to reinforce the local defences there. And in India, General Alexander moves his headquarters from Burma to the area of Imphal, the site of a brutal campaign and battle to come. General Stilwell also arrives in India. Now in Burma, Chiang Kai-shek, orders Chinese Fifth Army, already virtually reduced to just 2 divisions, to take up positions near Fort Hertz. Now the survivors at 22nd Division eventually reached the Lebo area between July and August. Later, the remainder at 96th Division returned to China from Fort Hertz. So in China, the war in China has been going on since the mid-30s and has been one of the longest conflicts. Probably is the longest conflict. I'm not sure if it's longer than Vietnam, but one of the longest conflicts of the 20th century. So the Americans have broken the Japanese code, I've explained that, resulting in decisive battle of Midway, but everywhere else the Japanese are still on the offensive. So in Burma, the Japanese have now virtually taken, by May 1942, they've virtually taken the entire region of Burma. The 4 divisions employed, the 18th, the 33rd, the 55th and the 56th, now begin mopping up operations to take up defensive positions. So the Japanese have taken most of the country. They're now going to mop up any isolated pockets of resistance and then fortify their positions. Now the rear guards of the 1st Burma Corps return to India and are absorbed into the 4th Corps. So it goes on and on, okay? The Japanese don't realise yet, but by the end of 1942, the Japanese are coming under a lot of pressure in a number of areas. So, also in May, reinforcements are sent to the Wau area, okay, to defend the Balula Valley in New Guinea. Now, native volunteers have been enrolled to fight besides the Allied, mainly Australian troops. Meanwhile, Mexico declares war on Germany, Japan and Italy. Obviously doesn't contribute much, but to be fair, they are out of the way. So in India, towards the end of May 1942, survivors from Chinese 18th Division reach India from Burma and manage to get over the border. So, Pacific 1942, the Pacific, just one quick word, the Pacific 1942 is going to be a number of videos, okay, because, even though I've done the Eastern Front, I've got Eastern Front, is it part 4 to come, to finish off the Eastern Front in 1942, but the next part, that will not be next. The next part is going back to North Africa and Europe for part 29, but to start that, going through the year, so I can mix them all up. But basically, the Pacific Theatre, even though in World War II many people mention the Eastern Front and Europe, and do mention the Pacific Theatre in relation to the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the two battles for the Philippines and everywhere else, the Battle of Okinawa, terrible Tarawa, Iwo Jima. Very few people also realise that in Burma, on the Indian border, in New Guinea, in the Dutch East Indies, in the Solomon Islands, so many other battles are going on. And the Pacific Theatre is such a large area with so many battles in so many territories. That's why the Pacific will be the larger set of videos each year. I'm not saying the battles there are more decisive or it needs more time to cover it or it's more important, but it is also a factor that the Pacific area is so vast and huge with so many territories with warfare going on. It does take some time to cover, but like I said, part 29, we will go back to Europe and Africa. Right, so basically, let us continue in the Pacific, okay? In Burma, Japanese occupy Kengtung, okay? One of the few towns in the country they have not reached in Burma, okay? One of the small isolated pockets. Now, in China, under Japanese pressure, the Chinese withdraw from Kinwa, okay, in Zhejiang province. The Chinese are still under pressure, and the Chinese have been fighting them, for a long, long time, and are still fighting and resisting the Japanese. China's always been a difficult country to conquer, unless you're called Genghis Khan, which albeit was a bit before modern warfare as such. So I don't know what people think. Do people think Midway was the decisive battle it's made out to be? I think it really was decisive. The loss of those aircraft carriers was a major blow to Japanese. I know one of the Japanese fleet commanders wanted the carriers to be accompanied by the Yamato, okay, and the Yamato's defense squadron, to give added firepower to protect the carriers. But Admiral Yamamoto completely vetoed risking sending the Yamato in an area where American carriers were operating, as he did not want the most powerful battleship built in the world at the time to just be caught out and sunk. So the Battle of Midway is over now. Okay, what we will do now is so a second, I'll have a drink. I'll just go through some more events, okay, happening in the Pacific Theatre. And then, like I say, in part 29, we're going to jump to the African campaign on what was going on around Europe, around Malta, the bombing campaign, and Africa and everything else in Europe. So it'll be, part 29, Europe and North Africa, part 1. So in the Philippines, okay, the Japanese, okay, have already completed the conquest of the islands pretty much. Though there are still some isolated groups that have not yet laid down their arms, the Americans have lost a fighting force of 140,000 men in the Filipino campaign that has gone on for 6 months. And it's a very unheralded battle. I actually have said a number of times, that I think that the battle in the Philippines in 1942 when the Japanese invaded it is one of the unsung battles battles, because if we think back, okay, Filipino troops and American troops were push back, then they would counterattack, then they'd make the Japanese fortify and defend or push the Japanese back. The Japanese had come back and pushed them back. It really was a tremendous battle, and I don't think I've ever heard it. Most people come to me and talk about the great battle for the Philippines, the 6-month campaign in 1942. It really was a fantastic campaign. So in China, after 4 days fighting, the Chinese are forced to withdraw from Chusian. The Chinese are still absolutely getting hammered, even though the country is so large and vast. It is not as easy for the Japanese, to seize China, such a vast country, difficult terrain. So in Pacific, okay, Japanese Imperial Staff mid-June determines to invade New Caledonia, Samoa, and Fiji. Okay, so they are the next targets for Japanese forces in the Pacific theatre. But in the area of Burma, things are calming down a little bit. The Japanese forces there are actually now, mopping up resistance and fortifying. Of course, in the India-Burma frontier will come 2 dreaded campaigns, one titled Imphal, one Kohima. Okay, 2 absolutely large battles and campaigns in the Burmese sector. But in some areas of the Pacific, the Japanese are actually taking the targets, and things are stabilising to an extent. They've just suffered the massive reverse in the Battle of Midway, and also had kind of a drawed battle at the Battle of Coral Sea. But the Japanese are still in a commanding position, because ultimately they still have, the advantage. They are actually, in the ascendancy. They've taken so much territory, they've taken so many resources, like in the Dutch East Indies. They're still advancing in China. They've pretty much taken all Burma. They've taken Malaysia. They've taken Singapore. They've taken sections of New Guinea. They've taken so many areas. It is quite frightening how rapid the Japanese offensive was in the first 6 months of the year. So in New Guinea, okay, towards the end of June, an Australian unit, okay, carries out a raid on Japanese base at Salamaua. Now, a few days later, a similar raid is made on another important Japanese strategic supply base at Lae. Okay, so the Australians are still active in New Guinea. Now, in the Indian Ocean, okay, British forces occupy Mayotte Island, north of Mozambique Channel, to establish an airbase. And in New Guinea, the Australian 7th Brigade is ordered to embark from its home base for Milne Bay. So in the Southwest Pacific, instructions are issued for occupation of the New Britain, New Ireland, New Guinea area. Starting on August 1st, the Allied forces are to occupy the Solomon Islands and then the northeast coast of New Guinea, finally Rabaul in New Britain and neighbouring areas in New Guinea and New Ireland. Now, later the date for the operation is put back by a week, but the Allies in the Pacific are now already planning counterattacks and planning to start retaking territory from the Japanese. Now, in early July, okay, aircraft carriers Saratoga and Enterprise sail from Pearl Harbor for the South Pacific in preparation for these planned offensives. Now, Admiral Nimitz issues his operational plans. The American South Pacific Naval Forces are to take the Santa Cruz Islands and the islands of Tulagi and Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Now, in China, meanwhile, General Chenault, okay, takes over command of American Air Forces in China. The bravery of his pilots in fighting the Japanese is what earns them the mantle, the Flying Tigers, okay, the American fighter aircraft stationed in China, who have many pitched battles, with the Japanese over the course of the Pacific campaign. So in the Pacific, General Harmon, appointed to command American Armed Forces in South Pacific area. In preparation for invasion at Solomon Islands, the ships of Task Force 44 leave Brisbane for New Zealand, where they can join the Combined Operations Force for the Solomon Islands. Task Force 42, a submarine force, is to harry Japanese communications in area of Rabaul, and the 7th Marine Regiment stationed in Samoa is ordered to stand ready to leave for the Solomons on 4 days' notice, so that to get all their equipment equipment ready, everything prepared, so they can be given 96-hour notice, at which point they will head for their target. Now, in the Southwest Pacific, plans are prepared for Operation Providence, the occupation by the Allies of Buna on the north coast of New Guinea. Meanwhile, in China, the airlift from India to China, operated by General Chesalt Staring Pilots, starts to function. So supplies are now going into China from India. So really, after the Battle of Midway, there has been a little pause, okay? Now the Americans are planning their counterattack, the Japanese mopping up in Burma, etc., etc. So the Pacific is now ready to enter the second phase of war in 1942. It has been a major 6 months, in the first 6 months of 1942 in Pacific, the amount of territory where fighting's taken place, some of the battles that taken place, the fierceness at Philippines campaign, and the heroic near 6-month resistance put up, the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, the Pacific Theatre ignited at Pearl Harbor, and certainly ignited for a solid 6 months after. And in future parts of Pacific 1942, I will cover further events as the Pacific War heads on to the end of 1942. But I will end World War II Part 28 at this juncture. Coming in Part 29, okay, we are jumping back to Part 1 of Europe and North Africa. So that's coming in World War II Part 29. I am out for now.